Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Poema podcast. I am James Prescott, your host. Welcome back to the show. Great to have you all here with me again. And I'm really excited today because a good friend and colleague of mine is back on the show for, I can't remember, third, fourth time? Can't remember. Anyway, Maria French, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. It is such a delight to be here with you. Not only are you an esteemed colleague and a respected thinker and podcaster, but you're also my friend. So I just feel like we're at a pub somewhere and having a fun conversation. So this is great. Thank you.
Absolutely, it definitely feels like that. Yes, we've had a lot of. We just spent like I think half an hour just talking, just talking on our video call before we started recording. Like it
Yeah.
just lost track of time. So because we haven't caught up
Yeah.
for a while. So yeah, and you're here to talk about your first book, which I'm really excited about. And there's an amazing story behind it as well. Like you just told me you wrote this in 5 months and without even without, 5 weeks. Sorry, 5 minutes. That's 5 weeks. 5 weeks. And
Sorry, that is not me bragging. That is me telling a friend off air, and he's just brought it on air. So yeah, but I did. I wrote it very quickly.
and you didn't have a plan, like an outline either, did you? Like it just came to you, like it was just like in your head.
Yeah, well, I knew I kind of wanted to write a book that split itself between spiritual memoir and theological manifesto. I knew I wanted to point in a new direction for people and take some ideas and theology and concepts that are usually pretty well tucked away in the ivory tower and sort of make them available at a pop culture level to a whole generation and a whole demographic of people who find themselves, quote unquote, what they call deconstructing. And I just felt like I wanted to add to the conversation years and years of work and research and study and my own experience and things that I've learned along the way. And so I knew it was going to have to be a little bit of story, like my story, but it also had to be really challenging and theologically meaty, if that makes sense. And because I've been doing this work for, I've been doing this work on an intense level for the last several years, but I would say, I could go back about 15 years with the work and certainly my whole life with my story. And so when I sat down to write the book, it was just all there. So that's I don't recommend trying to write a book in in 5 weeks. And to be honest, I didn't set out to write a book in 5 weeks. I actually set out to write a book in 2 to 3 months, which is still fairly quickly. But I just cleared my schedule and I said I'm going to do nothing but this, and it just came. And then which was great because then it afforded me a lot of extra time to do some serious editing and proofreading. And I'm just so happy with the way the book turned out.
It is really, really good. I've had a chance to read some of the book, and it is really, really good. It's one of the best books that I've read on this subject for quite a while.
Thank you.
It's called "Safer Than the Known Way," which
Yes, that
I
is the
love
title.
that title so much because it's such a paradoxical title. Like
Yes.
where did that title come from?
Yeah, well, I love antiques and vintage furnishings. I have a lot of unique pieces in our home, and a lot of it has to do with religious imagery. I'm just always drawn to images that tell a story theologically and how people have interpreted religion through the ages. And so when I go to antique fairs and things like this, markets, I always look for this kind of thing. And there's this one market I go to, particularly in the town we live in, England, in Rugby, and it's held every month. And this woman always knows that I come looking for religious stuff. So she particularly looks for religious stuff to bring to me. And she had this postcard, and I don't know how old it was. It's got to be maybe like 80, 90 years old. It had a classic William Holman Hunt. William Holman Hunt Jesus on the front. Jesus is in the dark. He's holding the lantern. He's knocking at the door. And it had an excerpt of King George VI's speech, his Christmas speech from 1939, in which he quotes a famous poet, Minnie Louise Haskins. And he quoted a poem by her that is known as The Gate of the Year, or God Knows. It actually goes by 2 titles. And part of the poem reads, "And I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, Give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than the known way. And I saw it, and I didn't know like what I was thinking or feeling, and it had this classic William Holman Hunt Jesus on it, and it's not really my style, but there's something about it. It was like speaking to me somehow. I'm like, I don't know, it was 50p or something like this. So I'm just going to bring it home. And as I thought about it more, as someone who's done a lot within the paradigm of radical theology like yourself, and a lot of this book presents radical theology in a very accessible, readable way for the masses is what I'm hoping. It's part of the aim of the book. As I read that postcard and that poem quote over and over again, it really hit me that that is essentially kind of what we're doing. We're moving, past the light, sort of into the darkness, and we're traveling a path that is actually safer than what has been known. The known way is laid out for us, right? The known way is traditional theism, Western Christianity, 2,000 years of Christendom and all of this history that we have. We have something that people are deconstructing, dismantling, decolonizing, disentwining, add any D word that you like there. And you have a whole generation of people who are saying, for me, this is safer. For me, this brings more peace. For me, this brings more comfort. And it's actually safer to go out into this weird, dark chaos than to stay within everything I've already known. So I framed the postcard, I put it on my bookshelf, and it sat there for a while. And when I was ready to write this book, I just thought, this is it. It's safer than the known way. And then the subtitle is A Post-Christian Journey, because essentially the crux of the book is what it looks like to live post-Christian while still engaging, Christianity.
Yeah. And it's very well written. It's like a story in many ways, like, because you start with your own story, which is really interesting. Like, even someone who's known you for a while, it was really moving and powerful to read your story and your journey into all of this work. And so tell us just a little bit about that, and then we can move into kind of talking about some of the things you talk about in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I wanted people to know that I have a story just like everyone else, and I'm not some theologian and some thinker just kind of spouting off ideas that I read in some book somewhere. I wanted people to know that I've actually been through it. I've walked through all of this. And if someone has had a similar experience, I can just hope that they identify with my story and find themselves in my story somehow. So that's why the first chapter is pretty heavily autobiographical, and then we kind of move into some theological ideas from then on out. But essentially, I grew up in New York. I grew up in an Italian Catholic American community, and this was our identity. We were Italian and we were a Catholic before we were anything else. Before we were Christian, before we were Americans, we were Italian and we were Catholic, right? So it was very much a cultural identity, and you didn't really stray from that. I grew up making all the sacraments. I remember walking into these big Catholic churches and cathedrals and parishes all over Long Island and New York. And I don't know, it was my DNA makeup that I would just walk into these cathedrals and look up and just be in such awe and such wonder. And, you had to be quiet, and there were people whispering, and I could hear the pitter patter of like heels clicking down the hallway. And, maybe I heard like the, deep hum of the organ, and I heard the confessional boxes opening and closing, and then I heard the dangling of the chain of the incense being waved by the priest. They were all of the sensory experience for me, but there was also very much this strong, profound feeling of there's something bigger and better in here than me, and I don't know what it is. It feels holy. It feels like I should be quiet. It feels like I should be in awe, so I'm going to respond this way. And then when I was about 12 or 13, my parents divorced, and my mom moved my sister and I to a really large evangelical charismatic church on Long Island. And that is where, most evangelicals and ex-evangelicals will understand this. This is where I had my salvation experience, where I quote unquote got saved, found Jesus. And all of a sudden, everything that I had experienced as a young Catholic girl, I was able to put a name to it. That name for me at that time was Jesus. And I developed this personal relationship with this, savior that lived in my heart and wanted to save me from sin and wanted me in heaven with him in all eternity and had this plan for my life. And, of course, this is what everyone told you. You're beckoned to come to the front. There's, well, you want to go to heaven and not hell, right? And you want Jesus to be your best friend, and you want this God that will look out for you no matter what, and then that just kind of sent me into a full several years of evangelical youth. So, the missions trips, the evangelizing. I went to a public school in New York, so I was constantly telling people about Jesus. I started a Bible club in my high school. We would do this thing in America where every September, all the Christians who went to public high schools across the US would gather and pray around their flagpole, and everybody's walking in the school and they're looking at you and they're wondering what you're doing. Like anything evangelical Christian I could do from the time I was 12 to 18, I did. And then at that point, I went off to university. I went off to Bible college in the Midwest, and I became like full on Pentecostal evangelical and, engaging in spiritual gifts and speaking in tongues and all of these things. And I was just any kind of ministry I could be involved in. I was just one of those overachiever Christians who just wanted to do everything for God and everything for Jesus as I possibly could. And then, slowly, graduating over 4 years, moving on, going into seminary, getting married, becoming a little older, getting a little bit of life experience under my belt, things start to change. And some of those ideas and some of those concepts and even some of those relationships, not least of which the relationship I had with God, the relationship I had with Jesus Christ, those start to change and evolve and even fade a little bit into the background. Several years later, I found myself, in seminary. I left the Pentecostal stuff sort of in my dust, and I was just pretty evangelical. I moved to progressive evangelical, eventually post-evangelical. And then, so many years later, I found myself in this post-Christian, post-theist, I guess, space. And a lot of things contributed to that, and I talk a lot about it in the first chapter of my book, but that is sort of that's really my faith genealogy right there.
Yeah,
So I've
yeah.
been around the block really with all of
I'm
it.
sure a lot of people will resonate with that. Like a lot of the guests that I've had on this show have a similar story. There's going through that evangelical Christian stage of life. I guess it's almost, in some families, it's
Yeah.
almost expected. And
Yeah.
then, things happen, life happens,
Yeah.
and
That definitely happened.
some traumatic event normally of some kind, whether it's a small event or a big event, but it's a traumatic event. And it kind of, suddenly we have all these questions, and what we have already isn't adequate enough to answer those questions. And
Yeah.
that's
Well, and that's really what it was. That's a great way to put it, James. What we have isn't adequate enough to answer the
yeah,
questions. And I think that's sort of what it came down to for me. And I wasn't really angry about this. I wasn't mad. I wasn't sad. Um, just I started going through some stuff. I went through a divorce after several years of an unhappy marriage that was a product of, our evangelicalism. And when you're going through something like that, as someone who's steeped in a church community, as someone who's seen as a leader, as someone who's seen as like the standard, there's a lot of pressure on that kind of Christianity and the people who are, within its grasp to sort of be perfect and be good and be holy and be all of these things. And as our marriage started to break down, I didn't feel like I could go and talk to anybody about it. I couldn't tell anybody how unhappy I was and how this just wasn't working and how it needed to end, like, let alone like the divorce word. Do you know what I mean? So when I got a divorce, it was actually a real big shock to everybody. And everybody was like, what's going on? Because I didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about it. And as that lack of talking went on, it wasn't only a lack of communication with friends and community, but it was a lack of communication with God. Like, not only could I disappoint the people that were around me, but I also didn't feel like I could disappoint this God. And I couldn't go to this God that I had invested everything in my whole life with all of this. It just didn't feel like that was something I wanted to do. And it was a dark place. And it was really months and years of what felt like God just evaporating and just fading into the background. And sort of, oh, this isn't me. Like, I didn't do this. I'm kind of out of here type of thing. And it just was this moment where I had to decide how I wanted to really engage my Christianity, or if I did, or did I want to be an atheist, or did I want to be an agnostic? And I coasted for a while, not knowing what I was, because once I got a divorce and kind of once my Christianity was just sort of shelved for a little bit, and I just coasted really. And again, I talk about this coasting period in the book and how helpful it was to be free from anything that I didn't want to be attached to. I didn't want to be in my marriage anymore. I didn't want to be locked into communities that, I couldn't be my real authentic self with. I didn't want to be locked into a God that evaporated into the background and didn't make sense, didn't, wasn't there for me, all of these things. And I just thought to myself, I am never going to be beholden to anything I don't want to be beholden to ever again. And that's where that post-Christian journey started for me. And yeah, again, it's all in the book, but
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, the reason I made that comment was really that was my experience, because I remember for me, the traumatic event was my mother dying,
yeah,
and like what I had already was not enough for me to deal with it, and
yes,
or to deal with all the questions that it brought up, and that was the start really. Um,
yeah,
um, and it's interesting that we're talking about this, because one of the chapters I really wanted to focus in on, which really spoke to me, I think, more than any
mm,
other chapter in the book, it's the chapter on deconstruction. And
yeah,
like, it's not like a super long chapter, but it's, um, I think for me, like what you talk about in the chapter is like, and I won't go into all of it, obviously, but there's a sense of like deconstruction is almost a sense of following our curiosity. It's
indeed,
born out of curiosity, and it's continuing to follow that curiosity. And
yeah.
so, tell us a bit about that, and kind of how you came to that view of deconstruction.
Yeah, well, the time period I just kind of described to you, I would say that was, oh, I don't know, maybe back in like 2014, because that's when I got a divorce. And over that next year and a half, I was working in seminary. I was an adjunct professor somewhere, not somewhere, but at a university, at a Christian university. I was in administration at a seminary in the city I lived in. And I was just really steeped in like theological culture and theological work. And I started to explore post theistic thought and radical theology. And out of all of the Bible classes I attended in undergrad, out of all of my seminary degrees, and at this point I have three. I have two masters, and I just graduated with my doctorate last spring. Radical theology and the death of God had yet to be like really properly covered. And obviously this is several years ago, so in the degrees I've done since then, I've made it a point to really study these things inside the confines of my classes and do my best to sort of personalize my interests there. But I think once I started to figure out that there were more choices between traditional understandings of God and militant atheism, I pursued that. Because for me, traditional Christianity, the big God who lives in the sky, traditional theism, all of that, that is so way past its sell by date. It's so 20th century at max. But yet we have like tirelessly and recklessly pulled it into the 21st century where it really doesn't belong and it's really not useful. And even when we update our methodologies and our meaning making mechanisms, and even when we bring forward how we do community, somehow we still feel compelled to bring these old theological ideas of God into the mix. And it's just, it's so unnecessary when we get a really big theological imaginations. And actually, that's what this calls for. So, yeah, I started following, this trail of radical theology that started to talk about God in ways I had never heard God talk about before. When people talk about the existence of God and the ontology and being of God and the object of God, radical theology talked about the event of God and the experience of God. And I thought, oh, what does this language mean? And then you follow that rabbit hole, and the language of event led me to the work of John Caputo, which led me backwards into the work of Jacques Derrida, who talked about this language of event and who connected it to the concept of the deconstruction, in particular philosophical deconstruction, which was actually, comprised of engagement with literature and words and signals and signifiers and language. And that's why when the language of deconstruction started to come to the surface in pop culture a few years ago to denote distangling yourself from toxic forms of Christianity, I thought, oh, how did they get this word? Do you know what I mean? Um, and, I've done a little bit with the current deconstruction community. I taught a class on it about a year ago. I think, when I was doing things with H and Co, we did a deconstruction class. We had a podcast series on it. I do a lot of theological coaching through my Patreon. So I talk to a lot of people about their own deconstruction journeys. I've had some stuff published on deconstruction. But I've really just tried to listen, just put my ear to the ground and hear sort of what's going on. And essentially people are feeling abused and used, and there seems to be a lot of trauma happening. People are angry. People are raging against having been taken advantage of for so many years. And they want to turn around and reconstruct something better in its place. And that is actually not how deconstruction works. I can understand that people want to reconstruct. I can understand that people want a nicer, more inclusive God, but that's not deconstruction, at least not actual deconstruction. Um, and, to be fair, people need shared language to talk about what they've been through and to share similar experiences. They need language to be able to convey some of these ideas. So I don't mind that deconstruction has been co-opted. But partly what I wanted to do in this book was present actual true deconstruction as it was first presented, because I think that it calls us to more risk. It calls us to sort of more danger. It calls us to more honesty. It calls us to more courage and to more bravery and truly stepping out into the darkness and truly traveling a path that is safer than the known way. And I wanted people to have, I don't know, power feels like the wrong word to use, but I wanted people, maybe agency. I wanted people to have the power of agency inside themselves to say, if this is what deconstruction is, I'm up for it. Because deconstruction doesn't give us a promise or a guarantee of a future, or that we will arrive somewhere, or that eventually we will reconstruct something more useful. It simply says, hey, once this breaks down, like whatever comes next in its place can break down again and again and again. And the moment something contains and houses and names and domesticates and says, we know that, magical alchemic force that is innate within all things to deconstruct, almost self-destruct, will happen, but it will only happen if we're brave enough to lean into it, in a sense. And so this is partly what the book is about, is to invite people into some of these ideas that, again, like I said a few minutes ago, unfortunately, and it's a shame, they're just not readily available to pop culture thought or conversation or readers. And I want to make these ideas accessible, but I also want to challenge my reader. So some of the things in the book will resonate with people. And some of the things in the book, people are going to say, I don't get that at all. That doesn't make that doesn't make any sense. And I've never heard of this before. And I don't really have any template. I don't have anything to compare this to, or, I don't really know what she means by, like, I want it to be a both and. I want it to invite people into a place where they're learning something, and not because they went to university or seminary or they read like 50 academic books. I want this book to present some ideas that they might get if they were in those settings, but don't have to be.
Hmm.
And not just ideas, James. Like, for me, this is life-changing stuff, because essentially it gives people a new way to engage Christianity that has nothing to do with the sliding scale of theism versus atheism. Like, that is such a tired conversation. I'm over it. I'm totally bored by it. Like, apologetics doesn't do anything for me. Like, you're just arguing whether or not things are real, whether or not God exists in a certain way. And this is why, like, I don't allow people to label me progressive Christian. Like, I have a real I have, I hate to say I have a real problem with, because I don't have a real problem with anyone or anything, to be honest. But when we're talking about conservative versus liberal Christians, you have a wrathful, vengeful, penal substitutionary sort of God on one side, right? The conservative side
Yeah.
of things. And on the liberal side, you have like a God that is loving and all-inclusive and pro-LGBTQIA and anti-racist and, pro the immigrant. You have this really nice, loving God. um, but it's still God, and it's still being, and it's still the God that lives up in the sky. And we're still talking about a matter of existence. We're talking a matter of personal being. And essentially, we're talking about an interventionist God. And this is always going to be problematic for this kind of conversation. And so that is why I use the words post-Christian or post-theist as opposed to atheist, because it has nothing to do with existence or whether or not God exists. It has everything to do with theological realities and how they can transform us if we let them. And it's about releasing our grip on all we think we know, on that certainty piece. I've had a lot of conversations with people who are like, oh yeah, you've just got to sit in the mystery. Well, yeah, a little bit of that. But I know when people say that, they mean the mystery of being. And I'm not, I'm not concerned with anything that I can't actually see. Like, I'm trying to move people past ideas of metaphysicality and talking about, if we are going to talk about religion, if you want to talk about Christian, if you don't, fine, you don't have to. You don't have to be in this conversation. There are lots of, Christianity has made lots of atheists of people throughout the centuries. But if you still have a horse in this game and you still want to be involved and you want to build upon your story of faith, we have to move past that binary of God exists or doesn't, or, God is mean or God is, it's so much more nuanced than that. And religion has to be, again, if we're going to talk about religion, it has to be a way into the world as opposed to a way out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I love what you said. Everything you said there. Like, one of the things I love about what you talk about in relation to this word deconstruction is that it's not prescriptive, and it's not a destination, and it's not boxed in. It's not just like moving from one place to another place. And it's not just about religion either. Like, it's
Right.
it's way more than that. Like, I mean, my experience of deconstruction is it's unlearning everything that you have been brought up with. It's not just the religious systems or religious beliefs. It's like the actual what is the system that we live in that has created the things, the circumstances that we encounter every day. Like, what has created anti-racism? What has created systemic racism? Sorry, that's what I meant. And what has created, all this kind of anti-LGBTQ and patriarchal stuff? Where has that come from? Is that just the religious stuff, or is it where is this all coming from? And it's kind of, you're not just deconstructing your faith, you're deconstructing your identity, and also the system that you live in, and kind of seeing it with open eyes. And there's this great story you tell in this chapter. I won't spoil it for anyone, but of Derrida, which I love this story. It was brilliant, and how, like, that was the beginning of, like, deconstruction had started, like, just by asking a simple question.
Yeah.
It was like the unravelling of things, like, because once you've picked up the thread, it just keeps going, and it doesn't end. There's no.
Well, that's exactly it. And that thread piece that you just mentioned, I love that metaphor, because John Caputo talks a little bit about what you just described. And he calls it, this haunting and these ghosts that call to us. And once we've been disrupted by these ghosts, should we ignore the haunting and the taunting and the teasing of them all, we'll fall into utter despair. Because the moment you're slightly disrupted, Do you know what I mean? It's like the Princess and the Pea sort of old children's fairy tale. She's piled up on 100 million mattresses, but she feels the pea at the bottom, and she's disrupted by this little tiny thing, and it throws everything off, and she can't sleep, and she can't do anything until someone attends to this pea under like 100 mattresses because she can feel it. And that's what these ghosts are like. The moment we start to really lean into and listen to the whispers and those things that we can sense and intuit and that want to come into our imagination, but our imagination has been so stifled by a very small, narrow understanding of God, which includes both conservative and liberal Christianity. Liberal Christianity thinks they have this huge imagination of God. They don't. Like, they're just as boring, just nicer. Do you know what I mean? Um, but once you have been interrupted, once you have been agitated, there's no going back. And John Caputo says to go back would be to fall into utter despair, because you are never the same again. And this is the start of all of that.
It's like once you've seen, you can't unsee.
Exactly.
And once you've tasted, you can't untaste. It's
You can try and run from it.
yeah.
But
It's like actually, I wrote an article on the pandemic a couple of years ago, and I called it Apocalypse. And the reason was I found out the meaning of the word apocalypse is the unraveling of things that are yet to be seen, yet to be known. It's basically like the word apocalypse is basically an unraveling of the truth, and us actually finally seeing it for the first time, and things that have not been known or seen. And it's not the kind of this scary word that we've been brought up to believe. It almost kind of sums up deconstruction in the sense, like it's like our apocalypse. It's like the unraveling of everything that we didn't know but we should have known about the world, and about religion, and about ourselves, and just starting to see the reality, be woken up to what's really happening.
Yeah. And I think the unraveling piece, that's so important. And I think as humans who have an absolute addiction to knowledge and to knowing things, this is why we have religion, right? Because for millennia, people have been seeking out the meaning of life in various number of ways. As things unravel, we very much want to ravel them back up again, just in a different, more noble direction. And I think that is the biggest challenge, is to sit in the unraveling for really an indefinite amount of time. Like I said earlier in our podcast, like I had this period of coasting. And I definitely, years and years after my coasting, and I still will, until the day I die, be studying and reading and gleaning new things. Obviously, there's so many ideas I present in this book. And at the same time, I refuse to answer questions that have to do with belief. And I get asked a lot, James, mostly by people with ill intent trying to trap me. And, I'll get questions that sound like, well, do you believe in a literal resurrection? Or do you believe in a literal this or a literal that, or an actual this or an actual that? I'm just like, I'm not answering those questions. One, it's none of your business, really. That's true. The first thing I say, it's none of your business what I actually believe and think on these things, because these are very private and personal matters. And I talk about that. I have 2 chapters on Jesus, and I don't remember which chapter it is. I think it's the first chapter on Jesus that I talk about personal savior motifs and how that's not actually the point of Christianity. And that if you do see Jesus as your personal savior, and if you are interacting with the person of Jesus on a regular basis in prayer or meditation or whatever, that's a personal matter, and that is your own business. And you shouldn't need to, that shouldn't be the litmus test for whether or not someone can engage Christianity. So the first thing I say is it's actually none of your business. Those are very personal questions. And the second thing I say is, that actually doesn't matter. What you're asking me doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if that literally happened or not, or actually, or empirically, or historically, or factually, any of those words. It doesn't matter. What matters is what we do with it theologically, and how it transforms our communities, how we make meaning with it, how it becomes useful to us in our own, human condition, and figuring out what life's all about. And for all intents and purposes, myself, you, the whole deconstruction community, we've decided that we want Christianity to be the meta narrative that we live by. And that's okay. That's a beautiful thing. I've decided the same. It's why I'm post-Christian and not anything Christian, because I will forever be engaging Christianity past it. I will forever be engaging God past God, if
Yeah,
that makes
it does.
sense. And I know it sounds like, and I say this in the book a few times, it sounds like, you're a guest at the Mad Hatter Tea Party. Like sometimes it's just hard to wrap ideas. They feel upside down. They feel backwards. But if you're reading the book and if the book feels upside down to you, I want you to know that you're reading it right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So yeah.
yeah, and it's really interesting because for me, reading this book was interesting because I have not really known what I believe, right, for a long time, and
Mhm.
I haven't
Mhm.
known where I stood with Christianity or with Jesus
Mm.
for a while.
Mm.
Like my understanding of spirituality and is so much different now. Like
Mhm.
my spirituality is informed more by science and
Mm.
intuition and
Mm.
embodiment and um like yeah than it ever has been before. And so like in a sense, like my own spirituality is kind of outgrown Christianity, and it's outgrown
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
a kind of
Sure.
religious system. But at the same time, there's still a strong element of Jesus at the in I don't know where, but
Yeah.
in that part of my
Yeah.
life, in that well, not part of my life, but in that experience of I have of spirituality,
Yeah.
Jesus is still a part of that, and the Jesus story is still a part of that, and some of the teachings
Yeah.
of Jesus are still a part of that. Like so, it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
still a part of me, and I still love the liturgies, and I still love contemplative prayer, and I still love silent prayer. I still love all of those things, and can have a divine experience through that. Um,
Yeah. And when it comes to Jesus, you don't actually have to choose, like, okay, do I believe Jesus was the actual son of God, or do I just think he was a human and a person like everyone else and he was just a really good moral teacher? Because that's what you find out
mm,
there, right? You find that and then like any kind of conglomeration in between. But when we move past empirical realities to theological ones, those debates, they become irrelevant, they become obsolete. They're not even on the table anymore. They're behind
yeah,
us. We're past
yeah,
them.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean? And there's so much freedom in that, and there's so much peace. And that is why the book is called Safer Than the Known Way, because it is safer in terms of the protection of our own sanity and our own humanity, and not sacrificing our sense of reason and our intellect and our intuition and our imagination and our sensibilities as well. Everything that makes us human gets to be invited into this post-Christian experience.
yeah. Absolutely, it's like deconstruction is almost becoming more aware of your own humanity and how your humanity can be
It's a lot.
divine.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that is yeah, yeah,
And blurring those lines between, like, the divine or the not divine, and the sacred and the profane, or the sacred and the secular, those are false binaries, like a lot of other things. There's a lot of people out there talking about false binaries right now, and it's no different here. These are false binaries. Like, if we're walking somewhere, if we tread anywhere, for me that's holy ground, or it's also profane ground, or it's both, because both are beautiful. Do you
yeah.
know what I mean? Like, do not have to choose.
Exactly, it's not either or. It's like
Um,
it's both and. Yeah,
it's both and
yeah.
and more. Do you know what I mean? And that to me is radical theology. I mean, radical theology is a lot of things, and I devote a whole chapter to radical theology. Not only that, but strands of radical theology are running throughout the entire book, because it's been very important in my own theological rearing of myself. Uh, and also, I'm passionate about getting this kind of thought into the hands of people who really need it.
Mm,
Again, it's sort of why I've written this book. So yeah, it's both and then everything else. And I think I say somewhere in the book, or something like this, take your wildest imagination about God and faith. Dream and imagine as big as you think you can, and then go even further than that.
mm,
That's what event is. That is what deconstruction is. That is what it looks like to engage what John Caputo, who's a radical theologian, says, all that is coming that we cannot see coming. If we can see it on the horizon, then it's not what we want. If we have imagination for it, if we can construct it, if we can build it, then it's not what we want. We want something that slaps us upside the head that we cannot see coming. We want to move towards a horizon with no line. We want to follow a compass that doesn't point north. We want everything that is subversive to everything we thought we knew. That to me is faith. And that's what I want. It is my earnest dream to know event, truly know event.
Yeah, that I love that you talk about that concept of event and that
Yeah.
deconstruction, and that was powerful for me. I've heard Pete Rollins talk about this as well, the idea of event, of like this thing that happens, and that we're kind of experiencing, and that kind of shakes us out of what we know, like the structures that we know and the certainty that we know, and the duality that we have, and like creates that rupture that you can't, like we talked about before, the thread you can't unravel, you can't ravel it up again once you've unraveled it. It's and you explore that in that chapter about deconstruction, and
there's a lot in the book. There's a lot I wanted to impart. This is my first solo volume. It's not going to be my last. But I essentially wanted to take years of work and put it in a wee book that hopefully will be useful to some people who are feeling all sorts of things that I was feeling. I think I say in the end of the introduction that I've written it for a younger me, and I've written it for a present and future you, because I essentially wrote the book that I wish I had 10 or 15 years ago, when I was, crawling around in the dark trying to figure out all of this stuff bit by bit to be able to write a book in 2023 and put it out for all of you. So this is I wrote the book I wish I had for everyone.
That often seems to be the case when people write books, is, I wrote the book that I wish I'd been able to read, that I wish someone had given me, that kind of thing. It seems to be a common pattern.
It was a labor of love, and it's a love letter really to ex-evangelicals, ex-Christians, Christians who have been let down, Christians who feel isolated, people who have felt like they had to leave their faith because they didn't want to choose between what they had and atheism, and now they're just floundering and they've lost their sense of identity and they're going through crisis. Like, this is a love letter to all of them.
It reads that way. And obviously there's a lot of academic stuff in the book, but there is definitely a real heart and a soul to this book, and a very authentic, personal, element to it. And this is true. This is something that's born in someone's soul rather than just in their head. And that definitely spoke to me, to my heart and my head. It was.
Thank you. That was the aim. That was the goal. I did feel very pastoral in writing it. It felt very pastoral.
And what did the experience of writing it do to you? And did it show you anything about yourself and your journey and maybe your spirituality that you weren't aware of before?
I'm not sure that it showed me anything I wasn't aware of, but it did show me my journey, full circle, in a sense. And I'm not a fan of the word circles, and people will know why when they read the book. In chapter 1, I talk about no more circles. But for me, it was just incredibly beautiful for me to write out some of my story, not all of it, but the parts that are important to the reader for what I've written for them. Write the theological parts, and weave in bits of memory and experience along the way. And so, yeah, I guess it was a love letter to the readers, but it was also a love letter to myself. And, to say, look what you've done. Like, look where you were, look how far you've come, look where um, all of the toiling, all of the grief and all of the pain and all of those times you had to go it alone and you had to make really big risky decisions. And I talk about some of those risky decisions. I talk about the motivation for some of them and who I wanted to be, who I dreamed I maybe could be, and different places I lived. And I moved to France for a while. And, I talk about all of that. And it was just a feeling of like looking back at a much younger Maria and looking at her being like, you done good.
Yeah.
Like I was happy. I was happy to see the journey I've been on and not nearly done yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see where your journey takes you next.
Thank you, James. So you'll be along
I
for the ride.
absolutely. I'll be reading those books and we'll be talking about them on this podcast, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for this book. Honestly, I couldn't recommend it any more highly. And thank you for all the work that you do, and thank you for being on the show today.
Absolutely. It was so my pleasure. Thank you so much. I loved our conversation. I love just chatting with you in general. So it was like talking to a friend rather than podcast.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you again, like for this book and for the work you do, and I'm grateful that you've shared this with us. So the book is called Safer Than the Known Way. It's available from January the 27th. Am I right? Fantastic. So please do go and get that book, and I'm sure you. I'm definitely going to buy my own copy. It's going to be I can't wait to read the whole thing. So, and where can people find you online?
Yeah, my website, mariafrancescafrench.com, has everything I'm involved in, how you can get a hold of me, and just my social media links, everything's there. So
perfect. Great. That's fantastic. So great. Thanks for coming on the show. And thanks for listening, everybody.